Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. Who's in the house? Bill in Mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Yehud in South Carolina, Bella in Florida, Jonathan in LA, Guy in Ohio, Lucy in Minnesota, Ella's here, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida. Welcome, everybody. Gonna do a double. I think that catches us up. Pretty sure. Somebody let me know. Is today's daf actually page 6, our second page here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud? What did I just see? Sharon, happy 45th wedding anniversary. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Wow, 45 years. You must have learned something about the secrets of a happy marriage. May you be blessed to have 45 more anniversaries. And you and your husband in loving shalom bayis, loving peace to 120. Okay, we are on page 5 here in Tractate Bava Basra. Today's daf is Mishna. Today we open Mishna number 3 here in chapter 1. Mishnah 3. In the case of a dividing wall in a jointly owned courtyard that fell. So if one of the owners wishes to rebuild the wall, the court obligates the other owner to build the wall with him, but only up to a height of 4 cubits, right? So 4 cubits is about 6 feet. That's what you need to have a privacy barrier between the two sides of the courtyard. If one of the parties wants to build it higher than that, he can do so. But his neighbor is not going to be obligated to share in the cost of a wall that's taller than 6 cubits and becomes quite a bit more expensive because, as we've seen, the taller it is, the thicker it needs to be stable, and it can become a much more expensive wall. So the neighbor only is obligated to participate up to a height of 4 cubits. If after the wall was built, one of the neighbors claims that he alone constructed it, and the other one did not participate in its construction. So the latter, the one who's accused of not paying his share, is nevertheless presumed to have given his share of the money unless the claimant brings proof that this reluctant neighbor did not, in fact, give his part. Okay, so a lot of the discussion today is going to be about presumptions, right? When can we presume that a person has paid? When do we presume that a person has not paid? And it's basically going to be, and these are obviously cases where we don't have evidence to the contrary, and that's why we might rely on a presumption. And as we'll see, most of the time when there's a kind of standard situation where people would pay their share, and then later somebody comes and says, hey, that guy didn't pay his fair share, it's going to be, the burden of proof is going to rest on the one who says that the other one didn't pay, because we would presume that the average person would have paid his share in that situation. And it's not going to be so easy to bring proof that he didn't pay. So that presumption is going to be a strong barrier to overcome in trying to, extract payment from the neighbor who's being accused of not paying his share. So the presumption is what we're really paying attention to here. Now, the court does not obligate the reluctant neighbor to contribute to the building of the wall higher than 4 cubits. But if the reluctant neighbor built another wall close to the wall that had been built higher than 4 cubits, in order to set a roof over the room that was thereby created, so the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay his share for all of the rebuilt wall, even though he has not yet set a roof over it. Why? Because he has demonstrated his desire to make use of that which his neighbor built. Therefore, he must participate in the cost of its construction. Right? He doesn't have to pay if it's higher than 4 cubits. But if he then makes use of the fact that the wall is there and is higher than 4 cubits, then he does have to pay because he's making use of it. And he shows that he agreed to it by making use of it. If the builder of the first wall later claims that he did not receive payment from his neighbor, then the neighbor is presumed not to have given his share of the money unless he brings proof that he did, in fact, give money for the building of the wall. Since it was built higher than 4 cubits, there's no reason to assume that the reluctant neighbor had paid. Then later he makes use of the wall and claims that he did pay. Now we can say, no, now you have to pay, and the half, because you've shown that you like it. And we have no reason to start with a presumption that you originally paid, since normally people don't pay for a wall, for the part of the wall that's higher than what they're obligated to pay. All right, so this general idea is we assume that people fulfill their obligations, but we don't assume that people do more than they're obligated to do, right, as a starting point of evidence. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Reish Lakish says, if a lender set a time for another to repay the loan that he had extended to him, and when the debt came due, the borrower said to the lender, I already repaid you within the time, meaning earlier than when the loan came due. So then this borrower is not deemed credible because, according to Reish Lakish, people do not ordinarily repay their debts before they are due. The lender would have been happy if the borrower would simply repay his debt on time, so we have no reason to assume that the borrower repaid his debt early. That's according to Reish Lakish. Abaye and Rava disagree with Reish Lakish, as they both say that a person is apt to repay his debt within its time, which is to say earlier than when the loan came due. And this is because sometimes a borrower happens to have money, and the borrower says to himself, I will go and repay my debt now, so that the lender will not trouble me later by constantly demanding the money. People like to get loans off their back, so if they have the money to pay it, they might well pay it early, right? Now, why are we talking about loans being paid on time or being paid early when we were talking about people splitting the cost of a wall in a courtyard? Again, because the principle that's being argued here is when we don't have evidence to the contrary and someone says, I don't owe you anything, I paid that several months ago, right? And no one can remember for sure. There's no evidence to the contrary. So are we going to believe this guy who says I paid that a while ago? So what we're learning here is, well, if at that time he was obligated to pay, well, then we believe him, right? Because there's a presumption that people pay when they're obligated to. But if he claims that he paid something when he was not obligated to pay it, before it was due, then we're not going to put a presumption in his behalf. He could still prove that he did pay it, but absent that proof, we're not going to apply that presumption that he paid it. And the reason is because he wasn't obligated to. But now with regards to a loan, we might extend that presumption, at least according to Rava and Abaye, because people, psychologically do sometimes pay their debts off early because they want to get it off their back. But in terms of whether somebody paid for his half of a wall where it wasn't that he owed it, that where it's questionable whether he was obligated or not, like this wall that was built higher than 4 cubits, then do we apply the principle of extending the presumption or not, is what's being discussed now. We're on page 5b. The Gemara attempts to bring a proof in support of the opinion of Abaye and Rava that people do pay off their debts early sometimes, from what we learned in our Mishnah that we're discussing today. If after the wall was built, one of the neighbors claims that he alone constructed it, and the other one did not participate in its building, the latter is nevertheless presumed to have given his share of the money, unless the claimant brings proof that the second neighbor did not give his part. In other words, since the normal course of things is that for a standard wall, if it was built, since both neighbors are obligated to participate in it, the normal thing would be that both of them help pay for it. And if one later says, weeks, months, years later, and says, you know what, my neighbor never helped me pay for that wall, he's not believed, because the presumption would be that the neighbor was obligated and therefore he helped pay for it. Wait a minute, where am I? Just make sure I got that. That the other did not give us part. So that it's presumed to have given his share of the money unless the claimant brings proof to the court that his neighbor did not pay. Now, the Gemara clarifies the matter. What are the circumstances of the case that we're talking about here, the neighbors in the courtyard? If we say that he said to him, I paid you at the time when the payment came due, when the wall was completed, so it is obvious that he is presumed to have given his part, because that's when he was obligated to pay. So that's obvious. So rather, is it not that he said to him, I paid you within the time, meaning before the payment had become due, while the wall was still under construction? And with regard to such a case, the Mishna states that he is presumed to have given his share. So apparently, a person is apt to pay his debt, to repay his debt within its time, meaning before it became due, right? While it was still okay for it to be outstanding. And this would be in accordance with the opinion of Abaya and Rava. But the Gemara rejects this reasoning as a proof, because here in the case of the wall, it is different than in the case of a loan. Why? Because the time to pay is not at the completion of the wall. It's upon the completion of each and every row. Now, that doesn't mean that every time the bricklayer, finishes a row of bricks, that the two neighbors are sitting there, doling out, $10 or $100 or whatever the cost per row of the wall is. What they're saying is that when construction is happening, typically, the contractor doesn't wait until the whole project is finished and then comes and collects the whole payment from, the homeowner, right? The contractor gets incremental payments along the way. And so if this guy says that he paid, it's not that he's saying that, I paid before it was due. He could perfectly well be saying I paid when it was due, because I paid those piecemeal payments along the way. Now, the Gemara further suggests, come in here a proof in support of the opinion of Reish Lakish, right, who said that people don't pay. In other words, we don't have a presumption that someone is telling the truth when he says that he paid before the loan was due, because the general tendency of people is to only pay when they are obligated to pay, when the loan comes due. So come in here a proof in support of the opinion of Reish Lakish from the continuation of our Mishnah about the wall between the two halves of the courtyard. The court does not obligate the reluctant neighbor to contribute to the building of the wall if it is higher than 4 cubits. But if the reluctant neighbor built another wall close to the wall that had been built higher than 4 cubits in order to set a roof over the room that was thereby created, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay his share for all of the rebuilt wall, right, including the part higher than 4 cubits, even though he has not yet set his roof over that section. So if the builder of the first wall later claims that he did not receive payment from his neighbor, the court is presumed not to have given his share of the money unless he brings proof that he did in fact give the money for the building of the wall. And why do we not have a presumption that he's telling the truth when he says he already paid? Because he wasn't obligated to pay for a wall that was higher than 4 cubits. And the Gemara clarifies the matter. What are the circumstances? If we say that he said to him, I paid you at the time that the payment came due when the wall was completed, why would he not be deemed credible? Of course he would be deemed credible. So rather, if we're having this conversation about what the Mishnah means, it must be that he said to him, I paid you before the payment became due, right? Within the time. And therefore, he is not deemed credible. So apparently, a person is not apt to repay his debt within its time in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish. But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. Here it is different because the reluctant neighbor says, who says that the rabbis will obligate me to pay for this wall? In such a case, he certainly does not pay before the payment becomes due, meaning before they obligate him to pay it, right? The wall was higher than 4 cubits. So he's like, okay, that's higher than I don't authorize a wall that tall. I'm not going to pay for it. He's not going to have to pay for it unless, right, there's some kind of a litigation where he's made to pay. But there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. And so he hasn't paid yet. There's no presumption that he already paid. Now you could say, yeah, but the rule is that when he makes use of that wall higher than 4 cubits, he decides, you know what, I will roof in my side. I will make use of that wall. That's when it comes due. And if he knows the law, that at that time he does become obligated. And maybe that's when he paid, but he's saying he paid earlier, right? And maybe not everybody knows that law because it's a little bit of a complicated law. So it's not the same as the very standard case. 2 guys have a wall that was already there. It fell. They're building it up to a normal height of 4 cubits. And then he says he paid. That would be the normal thing. When he became obligated, he paid. This is a much more unusual case, so there's no presumption that he paid. Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, acted in such a case in accordance with the opinion of Abaye and Rava, who say that people do pay their debts early just so that it's off their back. Mar Bar Rav Ashi acted in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish, who says people only pay when they're obligated to pay. Now the Gemara concludes, and the law is in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish, that one is not deemed credible when he says that he repaid a loan before it came due. Sure, some people pay off their debts early when they're not obligated to because they don't like having debts hanging over their heads. But most people only pay when they're obligated to pay. And that is the law. And now again, it doesn't mean that he can't prove that he already paid. Obviously, some people do that. The question is, where does the presumption lie, right? Where's the opening default position when the litigation starts? And if the debtor dies, the court collects payment, even from his orphans, based on this assumption that people don't pay their debts until they're obligated to. And even though the master said that one who comes to collect money from the property of orphans cannot collect unless he first takes an oath that he did not already collect the debt from the deceased, here he can collect without taking an oath because there is a presumption that a person is not apt to repay his debt within its time, meaning before it comes due. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages. What is the law if the lender stipulated a time with the borrower for repayment of the debt, and he demanded payment of the money after the time that the payment became due, after the time when the payment had come due, after that time had already passed, and the borrower then said to him, I already repaid you. Now, if the borrower said, I already repaid you, we would have reason to believe him, right? Because the time when the loan came due has already passed. But the borrower adds extra words, and he says, I already paid you before the loan came due. Right? Now, that we've already said, we don't work from a presumption that people pay loans before the loan comes due. Now, the lender is coming to collect the money after it came due. Let's say that the loan matured and was fully payable in January, right? But the lender was away and or not thinking about it for whatever reason. He doesn't come to the borrower until June. And he says to him in June, hey, your loan came due to me back in January. Please pay me now. And at that time, the borrower says, yeah, it might have come due in June, but it might have come due in January, but I paid you last June, a year ago, right? 6 months before it came due. Now, we already said that we don't believe him if he's claimed that he paid, before it was due. But does that presumption change at all if it's in a case where the lender comes to collect after the loan actually had come due? Do we say that even when there is a presumption against someone's claim, as in this case where there is a presumption that people do not pay their debts before they become due, nevertheless we say that in this case the borrower could claim, Why should I lie? Right? He could have said, I already paid you, period. Or I paid you in January, right? When it came due. So if he had said that, we would definitely believe him. So why would he lie and say, actually, I paid you a year ago, right? The previous June. Since this is a disadvantageous position to him to claim that he paid before it was due, if he's saying that, maybe it's because it's true. So do we believe him? Right? If one of the litigants could have advanced a claim more advantageous to his cause than the one that he actually claimed, the assumption is that he's telling the truth. So consequently, in this case, had the borrower wished to lie, he could have said that he repaid his debt when it became due, and he would have been deemed credible. Therefore, when he claims that he repaid it before it came due, he should also be deemed credible. Now we're on page 6a. Or perhaps, where there is a presumption against a person's claim, we do not say that the borrower can claim, why would I lie? We don't invoke that principle. And the Gemara suggests, come in here, a proof from the Mishna. If after the wall was built, one of the neighbors claims that he alone constructed it and the other did not participate in its building, the latter is nevertheless presumed to have given his share of the money, unless the claimant brings proof that the other did not give his share. How does this apply to the loan, to the case of the loan? And the Gemara clarifies the matter. What are the circumstances of this case of defense? If we say that one partner demanded that the other party pay the money after the time that the payment became due, i.e., after the wall was rebuilt, and the neighbor said to him, I paid you at the time that the payment became due. Well, it is obvious that he would be presumed to have given the money. That's the presumption that would work for him. So rather, and we wouldn't need to argue about it because it's obvious. So rather, is it not a case where the neighbor said to him, I paid you within the time, meaning before I was obligated, before it came due, meaning before the wall was finished. So apparently, even when there is a presumption against a person's claim, we do say that the defendant can claim, why would I lie? Since I could have made a more advantageous claim, why would I make this less advantageous claim if I wasn't telling the truth? But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. Here in the case of the wall, it is different because the time to pay is not when the wall was completed. There were interim payments made while the wall was being built. And so when this guy says, I paid you earlier, it wasn't because it's not that he's saying he paid the debt before it was due. He's saying he paid it when it was due. And that's why we believe him. Now the Gemara suggests, come in here another proof from the continuation of our Mishnah. The court does not obligate the reluctant neighbor to contribute to the building of the part of the wall that is higher than 4 cubits. But if the reluctant neighbor built another wall close to the wall that was higher than 4 cubits in order to set a roof over the room that was thereby created, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay his share for all of the rebuilt wall, even though he has not yet set a roof over it. If the builder of the first wall later claims that he did not receive payment from his neighbor, the neighbor is presumed not to have given his share of the money, unless he brings proof that he did. So the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of this case? If we say that the partner demanded that the other party pay the money after the time that the payment came due, and the neighbor, said to him, I paid you at the time when the payment was due, why would he not be deemed credible? He would be. So since there's an argument, it must be that he said, I paid you before it was due. And with regard to this case, the Mishnah states that he is not deemed credible. So apparently, where there is a presumption, if there is a presumption against a person's claim, like the presumption that people don't pay before it's due, then we do not say that a defendant can claim, why would I lie? I said I paid it before it was due, but I could have said I paid it when it was due. Since this is less advantageous to me, it must be that I'm telling the truth. And so now we're saying, well, no, we don't apply the principle of why would I lie, because if there's a presumption against a person, there's a presumption against a person. We don't cancel it with the mechanism of why would I lie. But the Gemara rejects this reasoning. Here it is different, since the reluctant neighbor says, who says that the rabbis will obligate me to pay for this additional part of the wall above 4 cubits? maybe that's never going to come up. So he didn't have that kind of presumption of paying when he became obligated, because there's this further wrinkle in the case, and that's why we would presume that he has not paid. Not necessarily because we don't apply why would I lie, but because there's a different reason not to apply the presumption that he did pay. Now Rav Acha, the son of Rava, said to Rav Ashi, come and hear a proof from that which is taught in a different tractate, in Mishna Shavuot 38b. If one said to another, I have 100 dinars in your possession, and the other one said to him, in the presence of witnesses, yes, that is true. You have 100 dinars in my possession. And the next day, the lender said to the borrower, great, that 100 dinars that you admitted in front of witnesses yesterday that you owe me, please give it to me now. And now the borrower says, I already gave it to you. Then he is exempt. But if he said, nothing of yours is in my possession, then he is liable. Now that's interesting. You're saying, like yesterday he said in the presence of witnesses, yes, I owe you 100 dinars. Today, the lender comes to collect and says, so pay me. And the guy says, I already paid you. Now, when is he making this claim? Later, when they're in court, right? So the evidence simply shows that the guy admitted that he owed, and then later, by the time the litigation begins, he claims that he paid, right? So he's believed. But if he admits that he owes the money, and then later when the lender comes to collect, the borrower says, no, I never owed you. Well, that contradicts what he said in the presence of witnesses. The fact that he paid at some point later than when he said he owed, there's no contradiction. He's just saying he paid it later. When he says that I never owed, that does contradict his statement that was made in front of witnesses, and now we don't believe him, right? We remove the presumption that he paid when it came due, and now the guy would have to pay. Now the Gemara clarifies the matter that we're learning now from Tractate Shavuot. What is it not that when he says, I already gave it to you, he is saying to him, I repaid you at the time that the debt became due. But when he says, nothing of yours is in my possession, he is saying to him, I repaid you within the time before the payment came due. And yet the Mishnah teaches with regard to the latter case that he is liable. So apparently, where there is a presumption against a person's claim, we do not say that the borrower can claim, why would I lie? But the Gemara rejects this reasoning and says, no, what does he mean when he says nothing of yours is in my possession? He is saying there never was a loan of yours, a property of yours in my possession. The purported loan never occurred, and that is what contradicts the statement in front of witnesses. As the master says, anyone who says, I did not borrow, is treated as one who says, I did not repay. Since it is known by his own admission that he borrowed money, he then becomes liable to pay, right? Because he admitted in front of witnesses that he owes. Later he says, I never borrowed. At one of those times he was lying, so he loses the benefit of any presumption that might have gone in his favor. New subject. The Mishnah, our Mishnah here in Tractate Bava Basra, teaches, but if the reluctant neighbor built another wall close to the wall that was built higher than 4 cubits in order to set a roof over the room that was thereby created, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay his share for all of the rebuilt wall, even what's above 4 cubits. Now Rav Huna says, if he built another wall close to the first wall that was half the length or the height of the wall that was built higher than 4 cubits, well, it is as if he built it close to the height and length of the entire wall. Since he can easily add to this wall so that it will be equal in length or height to the wall that his neighbor rebuilt, he must therefore pay half the cost of the entire rebuilt wall. And Rav Nachman says, with regard to that which he built close, he built it close. With regard to that which he did not build close, he did not yet build it close. Accordingly, he is required to pay an additional share only for the part of the wall corresponding to the new wall that he built. In other words, his new little building project in the backyard, does it give strong evidence that he is now pleased with the wall that was built higher than 4 cubits? And that's why we're going to make him share in the cost of that wall, even though originally we wouldn't have made him share, because his neighbor built something more than was required, and the reluctant neighbor doesn't have to participate in it. But if the reluctant neighbor starts to make use of the taller wall in any way through his own building project that, relies on that taller wall, then we have evidence that he is pleased with that taller wall, and that's why he becomes liable to pay for half of its original cost. And Rav Huna concedes with regard to an attachment to the corner of his house that he is not required to pay half the cost of the entire rebuilt wall. Meaning, if he built the extension of his house in this manner, it is not considered as if he built it close to the entire wall, as it is unlikely that he will add to it. And Rav Nachman concedes that in a case in which he places a heavy beam on the wall that can support a roof, or carves into the wall indentations to fix beams in place, then even if he has not yet made use of the entire height of the wall, he has demonstrated his desire to do so in the future, and therefore he must pay half of the cost of the entire wall, right? In other words, he didn't have to pay for the part of the wall higher than 4 cubits because he was not obligated. But if he now starts any kind of little construction project in his backyard that indicates that he will make use of that taller wall, then even though he hasn't finished that project, that what he started is evidence that he is pleased with the taller wall, and at that point the liability is triggered, and he has to pay for half of what his neighbor built. New subject, our Mishnah taught that if the builder of the first wall later claims that he did not receive payment from his neighbor, the neighbor is presumed not to have given his share of the money unless he brings proof that he did give money for the building of the wall. And Rav Huna says, even if openings in the wall were built on the side facing the reluctant partner, and these openings are suited to serve as placed slots where a beam could rest that would extend right from the neighbor's house to the wall that's taller than 4 cubits, that this does not create a presumption that the reluctant partner contributed his share to the building of the wall. And this is the law even if the builder of the wall made sills for these openings. As the builder of the wall can say to his neighbor, I said to myself that when you will appease me and pay me for the construction of the wall, you might want to attach beams to it, and I do not want the foundations of my wall to be damaged by your fashioning new openings in it. Therefore, from the outset, I built the wall with these openings, right? It's very interesting. So the one of them is building it higher than 4 cubits. So he's not going to be able to extract payment from his neighbor if the neighbor is reluctant. But he thinks to himself, once he sees what a beautiful wall this is and how suitable it is for each of us to make a roof over our side of the courtyard so that we can have an additional room added onto our homes, he's going to want to do the same thing. So when he creates this taller wall, he includes slots in it that could be used later to attach beams, not only to his own side of the courtyard, but even to the reluctant neighbor's side of the courtyard. And then later, the reluctant neighbor says, what are you talking about? I should pay you. I already paid you. And that proof is, look at your wall. It's got slots built into it that I could use to extend beams on my side of the courtyard. Why would your wall have slots in it if I didn't share in the cost of it? And the answer is, because the guy who built it, taller than 4 cubits, went through this thought process, and he didn't want slots to be carved into his wall later, so he built it in, thinking that eventually his neighbor would come around and pay him. But the existence of those slots does not create a presumption that the reluctant neighbor actually did already pay. Obviously, in all these cases, none of this litigation, none of it would come before the court if people got it all in writing and kept getting it in writing as they went along. But the reality is, so often people don't get things in writing, and then they end up litigating it years after the argument happened. Now, with regard to the use of a neighbor's wall, Rav Nachman says, if one acquired the privilege to place thin beams on his neighbor's wall, i.e., if one had used the wall in that manner in the past and the owner did not protest, so that the one using it can maintain that he had acquired from the owner the right to do so, he has not acquired the privilege to place thick beams there. Now we're not necessarily talking about a shared courtyard. It could happen in a shared courtyard, but you could just imagine neighbors. Like we actually have this on our street here. They're single family houses. They don't touch each other. But in some cases over the years, you see that people will share kind of like a wall built over a driveway, with a gate in it. And then the next house has its driveway there, and they might extend an arch, to this guy's wall. Right? And it's like the guy who had the wall first, his wall is now in a convenient spot for his neighbor to hang a beam, right, from that wall over to his house. Now, maybe he asked permission to do that. Maybe he just did it, right? Maybe it started by, there was a wall there, it abutted onto his driveway, and he just hung a bamboo pole, that he could hang a curtain down from it. No, who cares if a bamboo pole gets attached to the other side of, my wall over my driveway that has a gate in it? No one would care about that. But the one who attached the bamboo pole, to this pillar says, okay, now I've acquired a right to use your pillar to hang my bamboo pole, and now I'm no longer satisfied with the bamboo pole. Now I want to add a heavy beam over my driveway. But what's holding up the beam at your side of my driveway is your pillar that's on your property, right? So acquiring a privilege, what they're talking about, is sort of like an easement, which is normally like a path, but it's this idea that you can use the part of your neighbor's property that abuts onto the part of your neighbor's structure that abuts onto your property, and hang things off it. And this very often happens sort of like where people's backyards touch on each other, and like the back of that guy's garage, right, is facing my backyard. Like he's not even aware of what's going on behind his garage. It's his garage, but it's a wall on my backyard, So if I start like pounding nails into that or drilling into it and hanging something off it, like he's not even going to be aware of it. And so people will probably not even think to ask. They're just thinking, well, this is a wall of my property. But it's not your property. The wall is on his property. So how much use can you make of somebody else's wall that happens to abut on your property, right? And that's what they're talking about. So with regard to the use of a neighbor's wall, Rav Nachman says, if one acquired the privilege to place thin beams on his neighbor's wall, meaning if one had used the wall in that manner in the past and the owner didn't protest, so that the one using it can maintain that he had acquired from the owner the right to do so, let's say because he did it for 3 years and there was no objection. So even so, he's acquired the right to hang these thin beams off that wall. He has not acquired the privilege to place thick beams there that could create a structural tension on the neighbor's wall. But if he acquired the privilege to place thick beams on the wall, then sure, he has also acquired the privilege to place thin beams there. And Rav Yosef says, if he acquired the privilege to place thin beams, he has also acquired the privilege to place thick beams. I would imagine that right extends only so far as it's not a challenging, engineering load on that neighbor's wall. Now, there are those who say that Rav Nachman says if one acquired the privilege to place thin beams on his neighbor's wall, he has acquired the privilege to place thick beams there. And if he acquired the privilege to place thick beams, he has also acquired the privilege to place thin beams. And this version of Rav Nachman's statement accords with the statement of Rav Yosef. Now, with regard to a similar matter, Rav Nachman says if one acquired the privilege to let water drip from his roof into his neighbor's courtyard, so he has acquired the privilege to let the water pour through a drain pipe. If the neighbor did not protest about water dripping from the roof into his courtyard, he would certainly allow him to build a drain pipe, which would limit the water to a single place. But if he acquired the privilege to let the water pour through a drain pipe into his neighbor's courtyard, he has not acquired the privilege to let water drip there from his roof. And Rav Yosef says, even if he acquired the privilege to let water pour there through a drain pipe, he also has acquired the privilege to let water drip there from his roof. Now again, think, old city Jerusalem. Now the houses are all so close to each other. It rains quite a bit there in the rainy season. I've been in, old city Jerusalem when water's pouring down the the streets, which are all pedestrian streets with like these, like steps in the street, and a little kind of slot, carved into the center of the steps in many places so that water can pour down. Okay, well, that's in the street. That's the front of people's roofs can just drip down onto the public thoroughfare. But what about the back of your roof? Sometimes the only drainage that one building has is through the courtyard of another building. Now, let's say that you got your neighbor to agree to let your roof drain into his courtyard. Maybe you guys were friends, and he said, sure, you can drain in my courtyard. Just do me a favor, put a drain pipe so it goes right down to where the drain is in my courtyard, and it's not going to, flood and make a mess in my courtyard. And you said, of course, I'll put that drain pipe there. And then some years go by, and the drain pipe breaks, but no one really notices or cares, and now the water just kind of escapes off the roof down to the courtyard. The neighbor didn't really like it, but, no one really noticed or cared anymore. The neighbor was away a lot. And then maybe that neighbor sells his house. And now there's a new neighbor. And this guy comes and he's like, what's going on that my neighbor's water sheds into my courtyard, makes a big mess? I didn't allow that. And now they might litigate. And the neighbor says, well, your predecessor who owned this house gave me the right to have my roof drain into his courtyard. But was it recorded in the deed? Was there an easement? Is in the registrar's office? What did you actually agree to? Didn't you agree to a drain pipe and now it's not a drain pipe? And you can see how these problems are very, very real world problems that we're now discussing. Right? So generally, now they're saying the right to hang thin beams doesn't necessarily give you the right to hang thick beams. And the right to shed water into a neighboring courtyard through a drain pipe doesn't necessarily give you the right to shed water by just flopping off the roof. Now, there are those who say that Rav Nachman said, if one acquired the privilege to let water pour through a drain pipe into his neighbor's courtyard, he has acquired the privilege to let water drip there from his roof. And if he acquired the privilege to let water drip from his roof into his neighbor's courtyard, he has also acquired the privilege to let the water pour through a drain pipe. But he has not acquired the privilege to let water drip from a hut whose roof is composed of willow branches into his neighbor's courtyard, because presumably that's a messier matter. Rav Yosef said he has acquired the privilege to let water drip there, even from a hut whose roof is composed of willow branches. And the Gemara comments, Rav Yosef performed an action, i.e. he issued a practical ruling with regard to a hut whose roof is composed of willow branches, allowing the neighbor to let water drip from there after he had acquired the privilege to use a drain pipe, right? If the only place that your roof can shed is through your neighbor's courtyard, I mean, what are you going to do? You acquired that privilege because it was the only logical place for it to happen, and that's going to continue to be your privilege. But I would think that that's going to be limited at the time that it actually causes damage to your neighbor. Then you're going to have to pay for the damage or, arrange for a drain pipe to allow you to drain through there without causing damage. I mean, there's limitations on what we're talking about here, but we start with assumptions, right? Presumptions. Now, Rav Nachman says that Rabba Bar Abba says, if one rents a room to another in a large building with many residences, apartment building, they had apartment buildings in Talmudic times, so one rents a room to another in a large building with many residences. So the renter may make use of the building's projections and of the cavities in the external walls up to a distance of 4 cubits from his room. Very interesting. We don't think about this in modern times when, walls are walls. They don't have cavities and projections that you would somehow make use of. But when walls were made out of unhewn stones, held together with mortar, and sometimes the mortar fell out, okay, so you have cavities in the wall that maybe you could use to hide a key or some money or something, projections that you could use as a hook, to hang, your garden tools from it. And you can use that up to a distance of 4 cubits from your room, right? That's the part of the common area that you can use in terms of making use of the cavities and projections in the wall. But as for making use of the building's front garden, he may not do so. And I'm sorry. up to 4 cubits from his room, and he may make use of the thickness of the wall in a place where it is customary to do so. But as for making use of the building's front garden, that he may not do. And Rav Nachman himself said he may make use of even the building's front garden, but he may not use the yard that is at the back of the house. And Rava said he may use even that yard that is at the back of the house. And I'm guessing that there was different local customs in the different regions where these sages are ruling, where the typical thing was that if there's a front garden, everyone in the building gets to use it, but not the back garden. And in another locale, it's a typical thing that if there's a back garden, everybody gets to use it. You know, so regional custom obviously has to play into this, because that would modify so much what a landlord and a renter's expectations are when the lease is signed. Now, apropos the use of a wall between neighbors, Ravina says if one's beam supporting a covering for shade was resting on his neighbor's wall for up to 30 days, there is no acquired privilege for him to continue using it, since the neighbor can claim that he had assumed that the beam was there only temporarily, and for that reason he did not protest. But after 30 days, then there is an acquired privilege to keep it there. And if it was for a sukkah that was being used for the mitzvah of sukkah during Sukkos, then for up to 7 days there is no acquired privilege for him to continue using it, since it is assumed that it is there for the mitzvah and that after the festival it will be removed. But if after 7 days the neighbor did not protest, then there is an acquired privilege for him to continue using it. And if the one using the beam attached it with clay, there is definitely such an acquired privilege. Presumably it was attached with clay and the other one didn't say anything after a certain amount of time. He acquires the privilege of keeping it going. Abaye says, if there were 2 houses on 2 sides of a public domain, right, 2 houses on either side of the street, and this one, the owner of the first house, must build a fence for half of his roof, and that one, the owner of the other house, must build a fence for half of his roof. Here's a little illustration of that. So what they're saying is, they don't need a fence around the whole roof because there's privacy there's no one's looking into that roof from other directions. But the guy across the street can see into your roof, and people living up on the roof and whatever they do up on the roof, they need to have privacy up there. So it's interesting. You're not forced to build a fence on your side of the street on your roof so that you will have privacy. You're forced to build a fence there so that you can't look at your neighbor, right? Each of you is forced to build a fence so that you can't look in on what's going on your neighbor's roof, because the right of privacy, very important, right? We haven't mentioned it yet, but we learned this out at least in part from Matovu Ochalecha Yaakov, right? When next week, Parsha, Torah portion Balak, right, where the king Balak brings Bilam, the prophet, non-Jewish prophet, to curse the Jewish people. And he says, I can only, bless whom God tells me to bless, or curse whom God tells me to curse. And he's brought to curse the Jewish people, but he ends up blessing them. And the blessing that he gives, right, is, Matovu, how good are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling place is Israel, right? And what does that mean? What is so great about their dwelling places? And the Midrash teaches that when the children of Israel were encamped in the wilderness, right, 2 million, some say 3 million strong, all living in booths or tents, right, out there in the wilderness, the way they laid out the tent city, as it were, was such that the entrances to the tents and the windows, if they had them, never faced the entrance or the window of another tent, right? That the people were modest and they didn't want to look inside somebody else's tent and see what they were doing, with their privacy. And so likewise here, you have this right to privacy on your roof, such that your neighbor has to put a partition on his roof so he can't look into your area. So let's learn more about this. So if there were 2 houses on 2 sides of the public domain, This one, the owner of one of the houses, must build a fence for half of his roof, and that one, the owner of the other house, must build a fence for half of his roof. Right? You don't need two whole fences across that whole frontage because that's redundant. Right? So what we're going to say is, well, each of you has to build half so that nobody can be looking into what's going on the other side. Between the two of them, there's like a barrier that collects the whole thing. When you emerge from the barrier of your roof, you're staring into the barrier on your neighbor's roof, and vice versa. And that way they split the cost. Neither one has to build the whole thing. Right? So Abaye says, if there were two houses on two sides, this one builds a roof for a fence for half of his roof, and that one builds a fence for half of his roof. And they must position the fences so that one fence is not opposite the other fence, and each one must add to his fence a little beyond the midway point, so that each one should not be able to see the activity on the other guy's rooftop. And the Gemara asks, why discuss specifically the case of two houses on opposite sides of a public domain, considering that the same law should apply even if the two houses are separated by a private domain? What difference does it make if it's a public domain between them? If it was a private domain between them, they would still have this right to privacy. And the Gemara answers, it was necessary for Abaye to mention a public domain, lest you say that one neighbor can say to the other, ultimately, you need to conceal yourself from people in the public domain. Since in any event you have to build a fence across your entire roof, you cannot compel me to build a fence on my roof. And to counter this, Abaye teaches us that this is not so, because the second homeowner can say to the first in response, the public can see me only during the day when pedestrians pass by, but they don't see me at night. You, by contrast, can see me both during the day and at night. Alternatively, he could answer, the public can see me from the street only when I am standing near the rooftop, since they're looking up at that angle, but they cannot see me when I am sitting on my roof, pulled back a little from the edge. But you, by contrast, can see me both when I am standing near the edge or when I'm sitting anywhere on my roof, because your roof is at the same level as mine. And furthermore, the public can see me only when they look specifically at me, but they cannot see me when they do not look specifically at me, since the average pedestrian doesn't even look up at all. You, by contrast, can see me in any case because you live opposite me. And the master, Abaye, said above, this one, the owner of one of the houses, must build a fence for half his roof, and that one, the owner of the other house, must build a fence for half of his roof. And they must position the fences so that one is not opposite the other, and each one must add to his fence a little beyond the midway point. And the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that each one must make a fence for half of his roof? Why does this need to be said? Once you have the right to privacy, why are we spelling it out like this? And the Gemara says, it is necessary to say this. And it is necessary in a case where one of them went ahead on his own and constructed a fence on half of his roof. So lest you say that the other one can say to him, well, take from me compensation for the expenditure, and you build the entire fence, and that way we will not invade one another's privacy. Now that's not bad. You've already built half. You're expecting me to build half on my side. I don't even want to put a roof on my side, but I will pay for half of the cost for you to complete the fence, so that now there is a barrier between us. Can he say that? Can he say that? Therefore, Abaye teaches us that the neighbor who built the first half of the fence on his side can say to him, what is the reason you do not want to build a fence? It is because the added weight will damage your house's foundation. Well, my foundation too will be damaged if I continue to build an entire fence on my roof. I don't want to build a whole fence on my roof. I refuse to take your offer, so therefore you now have to build the half fence on your roof. Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says if one's roof is adjacent to his neighbor's courtyard, he must build a fence on the roof 4 cubits high so that he will not be able to look down into his neighbor's courtyard. But he's not required to build a fence between one roof and another roof. And Rav Nachman himself says he is not required to build a fence 4 cubits high on the roof, but he is required to build a partition that is 10 handbreadths high. Now, wait a minute. 10 handbreadths high, that's for safety so you don't fall off the roof. It doesn't provide a right of privacy. If we said that there's a need for privacy between two rooftops that are, across the street from each other, don't we have that same expectation if the two rooftops are adjacent to each other? And the Gemara asks, for what purpose, according to Rav Nachman, does the neighbor have to build such a partition? If it is to prevent damage caused by exposure to the sight of others, then it needs to be 4 cubits. And if it is to catch the neighbor as a thief, i.e. to set a boundary between the two properties so that any trespass will be construed as attempted theft, a mere partition of pegs would suffice for that. And if it is to prevent kid goats and lambs from crossing from one roof to the other, a low partition that is high enough so that the goat or lamb will not be able to leap headlong from one roof to the other would suffice. And the Gemara answers, actually, it is built to catch the neighbor as a thief. With a partition of pegs, he can give an excuse and say that he was merely stretching himself. But with a partition of 10 handbreadths, he cannot give such an excuse. If he was on the other side of that partition, it must mean that he was up to no good. And the Gemara raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Nachman from a Baraisa. If his courtyard was higher than the other's roof, he is not required to attend to it. And what, is it not teaching that he is not required to attend to it at all? That he need not build any kind of fence because his roof is higher than his neighbor's? And the Gemara answers, no, it means that he's not required to attend to the building a partition of 4 cubits, but he must attend to building a partition of 10 handbreadths for the same reason we just gave of Rav Nachman. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. It was stated that Amoraim disagree about the following case. If there are 2 adjoining courtyards, one higher than the other, Rav Huna says that the owner of the lower courtyard builds the wall separating the courtyards from his level and upward. And the owner of the upper courtyard builds the wall from his level and upward. And Rav Hizda says the owner of the upper courtyard assists the owner of the lower courtyard and builds from below, even including that part of the wall which is opposite the lower courtyard. So a little bit of a drawing there, right, where there's already a difference in height, but you might have to extend the wall up at the top. And the Gemara notes that it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda. If there were 2 adjoining courtyards, one higher than the other, the owner of the upper courtyard cannot say, I will build from my level and upward, but rather he assists the owner of the lower courtyard and builds from below. And if his courtyard is higher than the roof of his neighbor, he is not required to attend to it. And the owner of the upper courtyard need not build a partition because people do not ordinarily use their roofs, right? So the rooftops that we were talking about is where they are being used. And that's why they need those privacy barriers. But if this is a location where people normally aren't using their rooftops for anything other than, just to go up there and clean out the leaves from the gutter to make sure there's drainage, but it's not like they're using them, as a living space, then they don't need those barriers. Okay, those privacy barriers. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll continue tomorrow, Tuesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Questions on Bava Basra, pages 5 and 6. Joe, proof can only occur with 2 witnesses of the payment. What about if the contracted builder saw the transfer of funds? I think that would probably cover it, right? I mean, the question there is, there's one witness who's not one of the parties, but can one of the parties act as the second witness? That seems like such a basic question. I feel like, why don't I know that? I'm just not sure. So if the contractor is the single witness and the only other people there were the 2 parties, and it's, one's word versus the other, but, right, if one of them is backed up by the contractor, does that become a case of 2 witnesses? Great question. I apologize. I'm not sure. Jonathan, dripping water. I was surprised that the conversation didn't go into the topic of who owns the water and can guide it into a cistern or some rain barrel, right? Because here we were talking about water as a nuisance, right? And like in the same way that we talked about if a fence falls over onto your neighbor's property and you say, oh, you know what? Keep the stones. I don't want them. And the reason is those stones aren't really good for anything. And your neighbor, now what you've said is they're not mine anymore. I don't care about them. They're ownerless. And that means that your neighbor has the job of, dragging those stones away and getting them off his property. And the sages said, you can't do that. But if your neighbor says, okay, you know what? Fine. They are mine. And I'm going to use those stones because I can put them to a good creative purpose. And then I say, oh, wow, I should have kept those stones. You know what? They are my stones. Too late, because the guy relied on your statement and he acquired them. So there you have the case of where the stones of a fallen wall, are they a nuisance or are they valuable property? And I think you're making the point that water draining into the neighbor's courtyard, we've only spoken of it as a nuisance, but what if it's valuable property, especially in a hot, arid climate? Joe, was there a there a code enforcement at this time where a complaint could be dealt with before going to court? I mean, I think that probably before you went to the Beis Din, right, and had 3 rabbinic judges sitting there and hearing your case and, all the to-do of actual litigation, the first step would probably be that the 2 neighbors, if they can't work it out between them, they would just go see the rabbi, right? And the rabbi would tell them what to do, and they could proceed from there. But when that wasn't sufficient, one of them insists on his rights and the other one insists on his, then they end up in litigation. Where there are other kind of in-between types of arbitration or, like you said, code enforcement, some kind of agency. I don't know. But I think what's so interesting is you certainly don't have this now, but you had it up to, how long did it last? Hopefully for a long time. And in small communities for sure, where people were, where they didn't want to have recourse to the laws of Poland or of Russia or of Ukraine, where a Jew was sure to encounter terrible problems. And they would just litigate these matters according to Torah law. Or in ancient Israel, where the whole state, the whole nation was meant to live according to Torah law. What a beautiful thing that every dispute is an opportunity, to learn and apply Torah to a question that has come up in our lives. It'd be great if everybody lived that way. Bill, I'm quite taken with the idea that we are responsible for one another's privacy rather than our own. Amen. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, see you tomorrow, Tuesday, regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.